So you could speak to us tonight,
That is true.
that is true. And we're greatly looking forward to what you have to say to us.
Well, I will gratefully accept a glass of beer of some kind.
Easy, can you manage it? What would you like? What particular glass of beer?
Draft bitters, whatever.
A draft bitter. Liz, if you'd be so.
That would help me get through the next half an hour or an hour.
And that's so. After Andrew spoke, we will obviously take questions, but because the King's Arms have kindly hosted us free of charge this evening, if you'd like to charge your glasses in that time, there will be an opportunity to do so and to reflect upon what Andrew has to say to us, and then we will take questions. But Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gavin, for the introduction, and thank you, all of you, for taking the time to come out tonight, in the hope that you will hear something that provokes a bit of thinking and goes beyond conventional. I shall try not to be too contrarian, simply trying to make propositions for the sake of it, but I have thought about this conflict, and I am actively involved in working out on behalf of the elders at the moment. I'm not a Ukraine expert, so Gavin did me false praise in the hope of attracting a good crowd, which I see he's done, by describing me as a real expert. I do have expertise in conflict resolution and in peace building and mediation, but mainly in the Middle East and in Myanmar and such places. As far as Ukraine is concerned, as you will hear during my talk, I did go to Moscow in 2015 and met Putin and Lavrov and Gorbachev at that time, with a delegation from the elders led by Jimmy Carter and Kofi Annan. So yes, I can genuinely drop those names. And I did organize that visit, so I had to do a bit of homework beforehand. But the last thing I would describe myself as is as a Ukraine expert. But
good. Well, thanks for joining us.
This said, like all journalists as I used to be, I know where to go to get good information from real experts. So being able to check who the real sources are and getting good information from a wide range of really informed people is what I've been doing for the last few months. So I hope that what I'm going to say is not prejudiced. Some may find it faulty in one direction or another, but at least I think that it does reflect quite a lot of conversations, including today, with people who are actively involved in trying to find a solution to the conflict and who are trying to put forward various frameworks for it to see how there could be a possible solution. Now, I'm going to begin at the beginning, and if you were an audience at a play in Shakespeare's time, you'd be expecting to have a prelude. It's a normal thing to do, and the purpose for prelude is in order to be able to tell you a little bit about what you're going to hear or watch in the next hour or so, and it's also to be able to warn you, dear audience, about what happens to those who defy fate or social norms and the dreadful things that will fall upon them. I'm going to follow that practice with a little bit of a prelude. And I'll leave it to you to judge whether in this particular Shakespearean play, whether this is a tragedy and a tragedy foretold, or whether it's one of Shakespeare's history morality plays, which it could be also, because there's a fair amount of important history to be gathered from this. Well, it's certainly not, despite the fact that one of the lead actors happens to be a professional comedian, is a comedy. Now, that I think is something that's pretty obvious to you all. So, a little bit of recent history for you, and this happens to be a little bit of personal history, at least the second part of what I'm going to tell you. The first part of it you know about, but it's to place things in context. In the winter of 2001-2002, most of this audience will recall that the Blair government, not once but twice, misled the British public about the alleged threats posed by Saddam Hussein in order to sway public opinion and make the case for what was in fact an unjustified invasion of Iraq by the US, Britain and their allies. Now, this tale of the dodgy dossiers will be well known to you. Fewer of you will be aware of another example 12 years earlier, when emotionally charged, very sensitive information was deliberately misused by a government to manipulate public opinion and make the case for war against Iraq. And I was personally involved in that, in the case of trying to reveal it, not of actually perpetrating the false information, I should say. At the time, I was the head of Middle East Watch, which was one of the regional divisions of Human Rights Watch. It's now all one organisation. And I was involved in exposing this scandal as a premeditated lie. And this is what happened. After Iraq's invasion and occupation of Kuwait in August 1990, just as with the Russian invasion of Ukraine this year, there were many atrocities committed by invading forces. But one particular outrage gained special attention. Iraqi troops, it was claimed, had gone into a maternity hospital and stolen over 60 incubators with the babies still inside them, and taken them away to Iraq, leading to the premature deaths of 22 babies. Now, this is pretty horrifying stuff. And this claim was used over and over again by the Bush senior administration in order to convince Congress and the UN Security Council of the depravity of Saddam Hussein, to persuade them, Congress and the UN Security Council, to back the Allied coalition in expelling Iraq from Kuwait by force, which was using human rights abuses deliberately in order to be able to propagate the case for the moral justification for action by the West. Now, unfortunately, one important human rights organization, Amnesty International, lent vital credibility to that claim. Human Rights Watch, and I personally, did not, because even though we had published a major book about the human rights abuses of the Iraqi government over the previous decades, we were not convinced that this had taken place, and we refused to support it, and it turned out that we were right not to have done, as I discovered myself when I went to Kuwait immediately after the liberation by the Allied forces, and discovered that the incubators had been safely hidden away in another place, and that this information had been deliberately manufactured through a US PR company, Dillon Norton, in order to be able to make the case for war. So the war that ensued in '91 was mercifully short and successful. Kuwait's sovereignty was restored, and it's actually a parallel in a smaller case to that of Russia and Ukraine, whereby Iraq claimed that Kuwait was not a legitimate state, that it was a lost province of Iraq, as they claimed it as. That's what they said. And therefore they tried to justify their action as being justified on nationalistic and historical grounds. But what had happened was a precedent had been set whereby the misuse of human rights abuses by Western governments, the self-declared champions of the rule of law and human rights worldwide of alleged war crimes, had been set for political ends. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood right at the start of this talk. I have no doubt whatsoever that many dreadful atrocities have been committed by Russian forces. There is no reason to doubt that. But what I would argue is that the public narrative about the war as being one between good and evil is misleading and potentially slightly confusing. And worse than this, the case that is being made for legal accountability for Putin and his troops represents what I believe to be a highly selective approach by the UK and others to impunity for war crimes and towards the occupation of other people's territories, undermining its moral force. And this is a theme that will run through tonight's talk. So just weeks before our gallant Prime Minister, dear Boris, was leading the charge for justice for the Ukrainians, he told conservative friends of Israel that Britain would work to prevent the International Criminal Court from investigating human rights abuses by all sides, I should add, committed in the occupied Palestinian territory. And this is the same court whose establishment the UK was proud to have led, and to have led its establishment with. So it seems that the old adage that in times of war one should beware what one hears from politicians or reads in the media needs to be learnt again and again. The information war is alive and well, and consciously or not, we're all part of it. Hence, I hope the value of what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So this is my prelude. Now we'll move on to the main course. I missed your introduction, sir, so I'm sorry that I didn't hear your origins, but I gather you are either Russian or Ukrainian. You're of Russian origin. So you know this story much better than I do. So please correct me if I'm wrong. But what I understand is that the relationship between Russia and Ukraine is not at all like that between, say, England and Scotland, two neighbouring countries and peoples with long intertwined histories. I think a closer parallel is between Serbia and Kosovo, and I served in Kosovo for a long time. And in both cases, the reason why this is an apt parallel is because the smaller and now independent neighbour is viewed by the larger country as its spiritual and historical homeland, and is integral to its sense of identity and belonging. Do you agree? Thank you. So the origins of Russia 1,000 years ago or so lie in today's Ukraine, in what was known as Russia Mir. I probably pronounce it very badly. And Kiev is a much more significant city for Russians than Moscow is. And the Russian elite has long regarded Ukraine as inseparable from Russia. I heard this from no less a person directly than former President Mikhail Gorbachev in April 2015. His own mother came from Ukraine. And I was visiting, as I mentioned earlier, with an elders delegation soon after the Russian annexation of Crimea. So the argument heard from Putin that Russia and Ukraine are one country should not be dismissed so easily by the West as the ravings of a madman bent on revanchism. And I think a more subtle understanding of the situation is required, even if, as I continue to insist, the invasion of Ukraine was an unprovoked and totally unjustified act of aggression that offends everything we all stand for. So despite that, I think we have to understand that relationship between Ukraine and Russia. And I think this is probably the right time in which I should declare my own position on the legitimacy of Ukraine as an independent state and the rights of the Ukrainian people to self-determination. I think there cannot be any doubt whatsoever that Ukraine is entitled to its territorial integrity within its internationally recognized pre-2014 borders. Ukraine was a founding member of the UN in 1945, as part of the Soviet Union, I should add, when several of the components of the Soviet Union became separate members of the UN. And its borders were recognized by the Russian Federation in 1994 as part of the Budapest Memorandum guaranteeing its security, including by Britain. Under international law, therefore, the annexations of the Donbass regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, as well as the Crimean Peninsula by Russia, are illegal and must be reversed. There can be no compromise on this principle, even if its practical realization may appear to be rather distant. So this said, whenever this ghastly war ends, and whatever Putin's own fate may be, and the two may be interlinked, Russia and Ukraine will always remain as neighbours who need and depend on each other. They are conjoined Siamese twins who cannot be separated. And the deep emotional attachment that Russian-speaking Ukrainians feel for Mother Russia is real. It's not false, it's not made up, it's not a myth. And this will not disappear because Ukraine has now become a candidate member of the European Union, so despite the scars of war. Historically, the Ukrainian populated lands to the west of the Dnieper River, which Kiev straddles, were dominated by Poland, Lithuania, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they looked westwards for ideas. Lands to the east of the Dnieper were dominated by the Russian Empire, and its people became Russified. But the existence of a distinct Ukrainian language and culture, which are fundamentals that make a separate people, cemented by the shared bonds of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, is completely undeniable, contrary to the vile myths being propagated by the Russian media today and by Russian leaders. As a modern nation state, Ukraine is only 100 years old, depending on the date that is chosen to mark its birth soon after the Bolshevik Revolution. And its political life as a country was for long stunted by the Soviet Union. But I think honest historians would agree that it has all the attributes of nationhood and statehood. And it's against these historical and geographic realities that I would urge all concerned, liberal-minded persons such as yourselves to start thinking now, not later, about the future relationship between Russia and Ukraine the day after the war ends. In many ways, in my opinion, this matters and will matter just as much as Ukraine's relationship to the EU if the seeds of future conflict are not to be sown now. So why did war break out now? I think this is a question that some of you may be puzzling over. The short answer is that it did not begin on February the 24th. It began almost a decade earlier. Some people, particularly those who are inclined to Moscow's point of view, trace the roots of the conflict to what were called the color revolutions that took place in the states on the periphery of the former Soviet Union, starting in Georgia in 2003, and so-called revolutions which brought pro-West governments to power. In Ukraine itself, the mass disturbances in Kiev of November 2013, the Maidan protests, can be seen as the key starting date. The persistent narrative we hear here in Britain portrays events in Ukraine as a struggle for freedom, democracy, and a Western way of life. I think that's partially true. In my own view, though, equally important drivers of discontent in Ukraine have been kleptocratic corruption, poor governance, and a struggling economy with insufficient jobs, particularly for young people. So, regardless how far back we wish to trace the roots, and this becomes an academic exercise eventually, when President Yanukovych fled the country and took refuge in Moscow in early 2014, the Russian leadership became deeply alarmed. You might call it paranoia if you like, but there was a genuine conviction in Moscow that Western governments were using civil society organizations to bring about political change in their own neighborhood, their own backyard, and that Russia might be next in line. The eastward expansion of NATO during the 1990s had been the first warning sign to them, and Moscow saw this as a broken promise from the West made at the time of German reunification. And I simply let that stand there. Whether it's true or not, that's what they believe. So there can be legitimate disagreements over the basis for these complaints, but I think one thing we should all acknowledge unequivocally, and fortunately for us, the Lib Dems are an internationally minded party that is concerned about rule of law and justice, is we should acknowledge that the post-Cold War European security architecture has failed. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, has not lived up to its task and therefore must be reformed. One possibility is that it returns to its origins and it becomes a meeting forum again, and new, more practical, more hard-headed security arrangements need to come into place, because frankly they have been atrophying recently, and the agreements that lead to mutual confidence that are needed between countries that are potential adversaries have been breaking down in recent years. So I think that there are new security cooperation pacts, including nuclear weapons treaties and monitoring oversight mechanisms that must be restored, because the current situation is too dangerous and too unstable to do otherwise. Now, the West's reaction, its weak reaction to the Russian invasion and annexation of the Crimea, attempting to mollify the invader and putting pressure on Ukraine to compromise over the complaints of the Donbass residents over Russian language rights and autonomy that they were seeking, is often mentioned in the West as having been a mistake. I'm not so sure that it was a mistake. I think it's a principle that I hold in my own work when I teach or I work on these issues in other countries, that the recognition and appreciation of minority rights, whoever they may be, is a key to long-term stability in most countries. So what is being glossed over these days in the Western narrative about this war is that successive governments in Kiev failed to live up to their own commitments they had made towards the Donbass under the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements that were negotiated with Russia by France, Germany, and the United States. tend to skip over these things. So this failure fed already deep grievances in the Donbass against Kiev and provided Putin with a pretext, I insist, to use force in defense of fellow Russian speakers and fellow Russians. Now, Russia has, I would argue, consistently been treated as an adversary by Western European countries, despite some brief attempts to say that it should be part of the European homeland. And it's not being treated as a legitimate European state with interests that should be taken into account, like any other state has interests. And in saying this, I am not in any way excusing the appalling behavior of the Putin regime in recent years, whether at home to its own citizens or abroad. I'm simply arguing for a crucial distinction to be kept in mind between the Russian nation and people on one hand and the Putin regime on the other. And sometimes these are being conflated. So, in my view, banning Russian tennis players from Wimbledon or boycotting Russian musicians is petty and counterproductive, simply feeding the narrative of grievances in Russia about Western prejudice and determination to keep Russia down as they see it. So while a large chunk of the Russian people, I have no idea how many, some people tell me it's a third of the population, it's the less educated, do believe in the official justification for the war, this denazification of that they're reintegrating Ukraine with the motherland. A significant minority who happen to be the most educated and the most internationally orientated do not believe the official narrative. But these people are being marginalized. And I think we should need to be talking to the two Russias, not just to one, and we need to be thinking about this in future. So let me turn now to what you probably thought you were coming to hear, which is about the significance of this conflict, whether for Britain and Europe or for the rest of the world and the multilateral international order. And because the ripples of the conflict are spreading fast, especially for the world economy, and the challenges posed for other priorities that we all face, whether it be nuclear disarmament or climate change and the transition to green economies, all of these are going to be casualties as a result of this war. And I shall also address something that matters to me personally, having worked in the UN for many years, which is the possible consequences of the war for multilateralism generally, and the Western-designed, so-called, I would add, rules-based global order, including the future of the United Nations. In the first months, and I'm afraid we are only in the first months of what is likely to be a prolonged and bloody war, one that could continue for years, there are already clear indications that the outlook is not pretty. So we should consider, first of all, that we're still in its first stages and it's too early to judge its final toll, especially in terms of human casualties. I want to try to put this war into context with some basic statistics to compare this war with others in post-World War II history. Already over 6 million of Ukraine's 41 million population have left their homes. That's 1 in 7 of the population. And it's comparable to the number of displaced Syrians after a decade of war in Syria. Just keep those figures in mind. And also keep in mind, though, that pre-war Syria had only half of Ukraine's population. But in terms of casualties, so far at least, Ukraine is far below that from the Korean War. We tend to forget this because it's further back in history. But between 1950 and 1953, 5 million Koreans died, half of them civilians, in those 3 years. Another recent war that you will have remembered is the Persian Gulf War during the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988. Up to a million people, we don't have accurate numbers, reportedly died on both sides. Most of them were fighters. But by contrast, the last major war in Europe, which is in the Balkans during the 1990s, and I worked in Kosovo for the United Nations, caused the death in total in Bosnia, in Serbia, in Kosovo, of about 150,000 people, roughly. Maybe a large number, though, were displaced. And in parts of former Yugoslavia, like Bosnia and Kosovo, up to 90% of the population was displaced. Here's a little footnote for you, which which is that in my experience of working on conflicts, people in more developed countries, it seems, are more ready to move home, and once they find a place of Europe, especially in Western Europe, not surprisingly, they tend to stay there. You might be surprised to hear that in Switzerland today, the largest single ethnic minority group is Kosovo, to the good fortune of the Swiss national football team, I should add. Now, for Ukraine, as President Zelensky has often said, this war is truly existential. It's about nothing less than the survival of the country as an independent nation. And one scenario frequently discussed among those monitoring the war is that Russia will eventually agree to a ceasefire so as to secure its territorial gains and freeze the conflict in place. And it'll be following an old playbook in doing this, because it's done that several times before in other conflicts in its own periphery. But before this ceasefire happens, I'm afraid that there is going to be a lot of hard fighting ahead. According to recent information I had today, in fact, Ukraine is said to be planning a major counter-offensive in August, presumably when it has secured some additional weaponry to enable it to be able to reorganize its forces and go on the offensive. Now, one thing you'll have read about in the media, and I think I should put this to rest now, is the risk that tactical battlefield nuclear weapons will be used. Personally, I don't think this is likely to happen, because there is too much danger to the Russians' own troops and to their own population. I don't think that they would do that, and it's a red line that I think they're not prepared to cross. I think there is a greater risk, as we saw in Syria, where the Russians were complicit in the chemical attacks there, that chemical weapons will be used. And that is a pretty horrifying thing, which, how the West will respond to it, I have no idea, but it certainly would be one that they must be worried about now. I think that Biden is probably wiser than Obama was and will not declare this a red line, because if he were to do so, then it would be a challenge to him to act in some way that he can't live up to. I think, though, that it's possible that Russia might do this, possibly through a false flag operation. There is also another prospect, which I think is a realistic scenario, which is that Russia will deliberately reignite the frozen conflicts that exist in Georgia, in South Ossetia and Abkhazia on the Black Sea, and also in the Dniester region of Moldova. And the purpose would be to stretch the West and divide and widen its internal divisions. So even if the ceasefire is agreed this coming winter, and I think it's not at all guaranteed it will be, and it will be agreed when both armies and the Ukrainian civilian population is exhausted, my assumption is that this will not prevent renewed fighting at a later date, which will be aimed at further curbing Ukrainian independence and bringing it to heel under Moscow's rule. Let's just remember that Putin has been musing lately about his admiration for Peter the Great, putting himself in the shoes, and his predecessor's westward expansion of the Russian border 300 years ago. And when you combine that with his very public regrets over the collapse of the Soviet Union and the disaster he says this was for Russian history, you get the sense that he believes that this is his moment when he will try to continue to restore the Russian state in ways that could be very dangerous. And I think that these public musings lead to the stated goal on the part of Boris Johnson, Stoltenberg of NATO and others, that Putin needs to be soundly defeated. This conclusion and goal, and I put myself out in a different position, is one that I believe to be dangerously foolhardy. I don't think that it is in the West's interests or in everybody else's interests to be able to inflict a major humiliating defeat, because I think that it will seed the seeds of further consequences. Now, other consequences of the war are fairly evident already. Further waves of refugees, and these will stretch the limits of generosity of host countries, especially those countries on the front line of the war. Here, let me put in a note pleading for other countries heavy refugee burdens for a long time, from the Syrian war, particularly poor Lebanon, which has been over a quarter of its population today are either Syrian or Palestinian refugees, and it's in a disastrous economic state. But I think for us, closer to home in Europe and in Britain, as our governments are well aware, the biggest impact is going to be on our economies, and that's already evident. We see the signs of it as a consequence of rising energy and food prices. You need to remember that Russia and Ukraine together account for a quarter of all the grain exported on world markets. And Russia is a major exporter of fertilizer also, which is needed by the agricultural economies of many developing countries. The interruptions of that and the trouble that people have in buying it because of sanctions adds to the economic woes, and which is why the African countries in particular are deeply worried about where they're going as a consequence. And food prices are already rising, poverty is already rising in countries who are already weakened by COVID or by war. Yemen, which I work on, is one of those countries. Yemen imports 90% of its grain. Food prices are rising, people don't have the money to be able to pay for it, and the outlook is not very good. And you add to that the fact that Western aid budgets have been slashed even before the war in Ukraine broke out, and now as a consequence of the war and the diversion of money into military supplies or into support for Ukraine, however justified that may be, means that the rest of the aid budget is reduced, with consequences for poor and hungry people in many other countries. Who's talking about Afghanistan today? And yet only 6-9 months ago, Afghanistan was at the front of our headlines. But the consequences for Afghanistan in the coming winter are really disastrous of cuts in aid budgets. But the big weapon that Putin is keeping in reserve, which I think there is a strong possibility he will use, is to be able to cut off gas supplies this coming winter to major customers in Western Europe, particularly those who are most vulnerable, and that's Germany and Austria and their neighbours to the east. I want to say a few words about respect for international law, which has obviously been one of the major victims of this particular conflict. Because the fact that Russia, as the president of the Security Council, should have blocked a resolution which was directed against itself is so outrageous to anyone, especially someone like myself who worked in the UN system, to find that they flagrantly breached the Charter by launching an unprovoked act of aggression and then prevent condemnation of themselves, naturally brings the Security Council into huge disrepute, and means that the Security Council, as the internationally agreed organ after 1945 for coming together and resolving conflicts, itself loses credibility because of the breach of the Charter. But to make things worse, and I'm jumping ahead to my own thoughts about the United Nations, the weak response of the UN Secretary General and the fact that Guterres is frankly missing in action has been noticed very much by former UN employees, former UN staffers, some of whom of us, and I'm part of one group, have been forming a reflection group to think of a framework for dialogue to try to push the UN to taking some forward-looking action. But what I want to say is that respect for international law has been declining for some years anyway. It didn't start with this particular conflict, and particularly respect for the Geneva Conventions on protecting civilian populations or unarmed combatants at the time of warfare. And in part, this decline is due to deeper, more systemic factors like the rise of artificial intelligence in warfare, like the rise of the use of drones for targeted assassinations, of which America is the main proponent of doing that. So I think that in some ways, the blame for this erosion of respect for international law goes back some time. We just haven't been paying attention to it. And I regret to have to be so blunt about this, but I think that this way in which the West wanted to have its cake and eat it over the claims of defending the rule of law has undermined the moral high ground that the West likes to claim. And the hypocrisy and double standards that have been displayed over Libya, over Iraq, over Yemen, Palestine, and now Western Sahara are there for all to see. And it's not just us who are noticing this. Many major countries in the world, countries like South Africa, India, Brazil, no longer wish to follow the lead from the West because they say, that's your war. You cheated and broke the rules in the past. Therefore, we're not going to side with you. We don't believe in following your lead any longer. So the claim that Washington and its allies, led by Britain, have made that we're the ones standing up for a fair, rules-based international order has been exposed by those who are no longer willing to follow. And this has profound consequences for the ability in future to be able to bring together a global community, because I think we're going to be seeing a breaking into large regional blocks of countries who will take different attitudes, but the overall sense that we are one people, one set of rules for everybody, and that law has to be applied equally to everyone has been undermined, I think, quite seriously by the actions of the West. So while we condemn the actions of Russia unequivocally over the Ukraine, let's think about what happened with Iraq, which is an obvious example, Kuwait, Palestine. If Russia gets away with it, I think that the fate of Taiwan at the hands of China is going to look much grimmer, and then we'll be in the world of the jungle where might is right. So let me say a few words before I close on the consequences for the United Nations. To me, this is potentially a League of Nations moment. By that I mean that it's one of those moments late in the life of a multilateral organization which has been living on borrowed time for some time, and the Russian flagrant challenge to the Charter and to the system which the UN represents means that we could find that the UN starts to decline into irrelevance. It'll go through the motions, all right. It'll continue making the right noises. People will come and give speeches in New York. That ritual will continue. But it will lose its significance, and it'll lose its credibility and its ability to be able to enforce its authority by its moral authority as being an organ that is concerned with the world. This has consequences for Britain. One of Britain's proud boasts is that it's a P5 member. I personally think that there should be UN reform and that Britain doesn't deserve to maintain its seat as a permanent member of the Security Council. I think it's outdated, and that Security Council reform is badly needed. I think in practice it's very difficult to do because of the quarrels between all the candidate countries for permanent membership. But nevertheless, the fact is that Britain, post-Brexit, sees itself, its place in the world, through the fact that it has a permanent seat on the Security Council. It's not only prestige, its power, its influence, to be able to reflect what it does. So I fear that the consequences of the war are going to run for some time, and they will lead to much greater poverty in many countries of the world where they cannot afford it. It'll lead to greater internal divisions among countries and between countries. And where it'll leave the poor Ukrainian people and the poor Russian people who are being used by this regime is very hard to tell, and it depends on how the war ends. Which is why I think that it's necessary to start thinking now about a process, not the substance of it, but the process. Neither Russia nor Ukraine are ready now for serious negotiations. Neither of them wants to start talking. Both of them think that they can prevail on the battlefield with their goals. And so therefore, sadly, we have to put up with quite a lot more death and destruction for some time to come. But those ripples are really going all around the world, and we are going to be able to look again at the kaleidoscope of the relationships that have been shaken up and are going to be looking rather different in some time to come. So we might think that Britain still remains the same as a country, but when I see Boris Johnson acting as Churchill, I'm afraid that I really worry about whether good sense is being applied and whether he has good advisors. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, ladies and gentlemen, on that tour de force with that hugely optimistic view, I certainly need a stiff drink. I don't know about the rest of you. So we'll take a few minutes break, if we may, to allow those to recharge their glasses or at least get to theirs. And then we'll take some questions.